and welcome to the Oxygen Addict Triathlon Podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors, precisionhydration.com. Personalize your hydration strategy today at precisionhydration.com with electrolytes in different strengths to match how you sweat. You can get a free trial pack worth $9.99 using the code OxygenAddict. And we're also brought to you by Thriver.co. Track your health with a personalized at-home finger prick blood test. You can use the code OxygenAddict50 for 50% off your first test. And we're going to be hearing more today about how the Thriver test can be really used in the real world. Now, today I've got a special edition for you. First up, I'm going to kick off by saying Happy New Year, everybody. I decided to record this one a couple of days before New Year and release it really early in the morning because hopefully you guys have seen this pop up in your feed and you're out cycling or running or on your way for a swim first thing on New Year's Day. So it's a great way to kick off the new year. And I hope it's a fantastic one for you. I hope you've got your goals and your events lined up. And I hope you're excited about making a training plan and excited for all the fresh new starts that the new year brings for you. I know that I am, I tell you. So the idea of today's podcast, it's a special edition. It is with a doctor called Dr. Anton Krige. And we wanted to focus on the simple topic of improving performance and health. So this is everything from looking at all the ways that, well, Dr. Anton calls these your 5 pillars or the 5 performance killers. You're going to hear him talk about this in a bit. He talks about your hormones, your gut microbiome, your blood sugar control, your circadian rhythms, so your hormones being influenced by sleep, and the delivery of oxygen. So these 5 things are going to massively, massively influence not just how you train and how you perform in your sporting endeavors, but also in how you feel and how your body feels in everyday life. And a lot of you will know, as long-time listeners, I've had a pretty challenging year. 2019 has been difficult for me on a health front for a number of reasons that we'll go into during the podcast. But it's been really interesting for me to go from this journey of being someone who was relatively fit and fast relative to my peers and very, very healthy relative to my peers to frankly feeling pretty rubbish a lot of the time. And you'll have heard me talk about having done some Thriver blood tests. And for me, they came along at a really amazing time because if I hadn't done those blood tests, I would still to this day not really have any idea about what had been going on with my blood biochemistry and with what was going on in my body in general. But having had access to those simple sort of do-at-home blood tests that are relatively inexpensive, certainly a lot less time-consuming than going to the doctors and having a big vial of blood drawn, it really let me get to the bottom of, firstly, what was going on in my biochemistry. And then the second piece of the puzzle, luckily for me, Dr. Anton Krige was or is a listener of the podcast, and he contacted me and said, look, let's have a chat with me over Skype. Let me have a look at your blood tests and I'll give you some feedback as to what's going on. And as you'll hear in today's episode, he very much looks at the underlying causes of why you may have health issues rather than, for me, I was going, well, this hormone level's low or this vitamin level's low, so that's the problem. What he allowed me to see was there are a lot of these fundamentals that go into making up exactly what's going on in your body that's much more complex than simply eating the right amount and things like that. So I really hope that you're going to find this as interesting as I did. I invited him onto the show after he'd done this consultation with me because I learned so much in a 30-minute chat with him. I said, look, we can make an hour-long special on this. I think people will, learn loads from, much, much more so than they'll learn from reading a book or, the accumulated wisdom, what they might pick up in magazines along the way. So it was fascinating for me. And he goes into an absolute ton of detail. And honestly, my original plan was to do one about how athletes' bodies change as they age and sort of mid-40s onwards, what changes are we going to be expecting to be seen. But as you'll hear, it goes much more beyond this. It goes into sort of the fundamentals of how everybody at any age can sort of look after the body and get more out of their life in general. And before we kick this off, Dr. Anton contacted me after we recorded the show, and he said, look, do me a favor, just read out this quick disclaimer because obviously, working as a medical doctor, there are certain guidelines he's got to adhere to. So we'll read this out first. Dr. Krige has stated that nothing said in the podcast should be construed as personal medical advice and is just for general information. Always obtain professional medical advice before implementing any changes based on test results and obtain professional interpretation of the results. So there you go. That's the official medical disclaimer there. What I will say is Anton uses the Thriver blood tests within his own practice, which was really interesting for me to hear. He thinks it's like a fantastic cost-effective solution for blood testing. So if you're an athlete and you're interested in getting your iron levels, your testosterone levels, your liver function, vitamin B12, vitamin D, or if you're generally interested in your health, things like thyroid function, diabetes, cholesterol, omega-3 and omega-6, you can get all of those in a personalized Thriver blood test. You can choose the ones that you want. Obviously, the more tests you choose, the more expensive it is. The less tests you choose, the cheaper it is. But for me, just doing that base test was a massive eye-opener in terms of I thought I was healthy, and it turns out that wasn't the case at all. So if you decide you want to have one of these done after listening to the show, you can go to thriver.co, use the code OxygenAddict50, and that you get you 50% off your first test, no matter how expensive it should have been. So with all that said and done, I'm going to hand us over to our interview of the week with Dr. Anton Krige. Anton, thanks very much for joining us on the show. It's going to be very interesting, I think, for the listeners to get a bit of a handle on the kind of stuff that you and I have been talking about behind the scenes. Obviously, let's kick off by talking about you and your background in medicine and your background as an endurance athlete as well, because one of the big challenges for me was going to see a GP who didn't look like he or she had ever done very much exercise at all. And I'm aware that we as listeners are total outliers in society to the amount of exercise and the amount of training we want to do. So it's good to talk to a doctor who understands the endurance mindset as well. So tell us a bit about your background to kick it off.
Okay, well, first, Rob, thanks for inviting me on the podcast and giving me an opportunity to share some of my insights I've gained. Firstly, I'm also one of those madmen. I've been doing endurance for probably about 30 years. I'm 50 next year, and I did my first marathon in 1989, to date me a little bit. First triathlon in 1993, so that was when I was at med school. Grew up in South Africa. Did my medical school training in South Africa, and it's an endurance mad country. So where people do the London Marathon over here, they do the Comrades Marathon over there, which is a double. So did a bunch of marathons in my early 20s, a few ultra marathons, got into triathlon, qualified med school in 1994. So that makes me 25 years a medic now, and then came over to UK in 96. So I've been here almost a quarter of a century. Did a couple of Ironmans in the late 90s, 2000. Again, to date me, one of the ones I did was road, but back then it was Ironman Germany.
Oh, wow. So
before what it was called.
Big change, hey?
Yes, I did Switzerland, Germany, and so on. The longest day, which used to be the only Ironman in England back in those days.
I think you and me might be the only two people who remember that.
Yeah, back in the Black Country. And then I did the inaugural UK 70.3 when it was still called half Ironmans. So it was half Ironman UK and was at Clamberis.
That's right.
Finished at Carnarvon Castle. And then did ITU Long Distance Worlds, qualified off that for the South African age group team. And that's really the last time I really delved into long distance tries. And following really in the last bunch of years, I made things more sort of longevity and time efficiency focused. So I really now mostly alternate between obstacle course races and sprint distance tries for the last 5 or 6 years. And I think just with the aging body, I think there's personally sort of more benefit out of the power and speed, strength side of things, and a little bit of the agility and lateral movement thrown in with the obstacle course racing, and it's a lot of fun. So that's sort of my kind of endurance sports side of things.
Yeah, so you definitely
kind of done the full spectrum.
Yeah, you understand the madness because you've got the madness.
That's it. And having said that, I'm making a little long distance comeback next year.
Oh, really?
because I'm turning 50, I've entered one of the races I've always wanted to do. So I'm doing Alpe d'Huez next year.
Oh, fantastic!
Next July. So I'm just starting a little gradual build towards that. So I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to the climbs. And then from the medical side of things, I ended up specializing in the UK in anesthesia and intensive care medicine.
Okay.
And perioperative medicine. So I ended up completing specialization and becoming an NHS consultant in the intensive care unit anesthesia. Just over 15 years worth of that now as a consultant. So that's what I spend the majority of my week doing. I've also been heavily involved in research in the NHS for the last over 10 years, and a lot of quality improvement work. But then, like a lot of consultants do a day of their working week in the private sector within their specialty. I've instead more recently moved over to using that time to work with patients who've got chronic illnesses that they're struggling to resolve, and trying to work out what the root causes of causing it all, rather than just treating the symptoms, and try to repair it from the root cause upwards. And the same sort of principles apply to athletes. Athletes don't tend to be at the extreme end where they have an actual autoimmune disease or a neurodegenerative disease, but they'll have a lot of the same underlying root cause issues that may be holding back their performance, or giving them various symptoms which they've put down to middle age and aging. But it's probably not. It's probably something that can be resolved. And then at the same time, it's really about being able to perform at a high level, but still maintain health at the same time. Because we know the two are not necessarily the same thing. You can be an extremely elite athlete and be very metabolically broken on the inside. And eventually that catches up.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
And that's really how we ended up talking, isn't it? You were listening to the podcast and you contacted me when I was talking about the various challenges I was having. And that was exactly where I was. I was thinking, I'm in my mid-40s, headed into my late mid-40s. I'm struggling with feeling exhausted a lot. I can't train like I used to. And part of my brain was thinking, well, it's not just part of my brain, but you have a conversation with my parents and they say, you're just getting old, son. That's just what happens when you get into middle age. You won't be able to feel the same. And I started thinking, well, yeah, maybe there's something to this. But having talked with you, firstly, having had all these blood tests done with Thriver and seeing that there were things that were way out of whack in there, and I'm thinking, right, I need to get this stuff sorted out, but I just don't know how. I think it resonated with a lot of our listeners that when you've been fit and relatively healthy, or felt relatively healthy your whole life, when you suddenly don't feel healthy, you've got nowhere to turn and you don't really know where to get answers from. So having the opportunity to talk to you and having the medical professional look over the results and saying, well, yes, this is what this means and this is how we fix it, gave me a real sort of there's hope. This isn't the long road to decline to death and beyond. So one of the things that we got from the chat that you and I have had before, you talked a lot, and I was very interested in this. You mentioned just before you're looking for the root cause of problems rather than treating the symptoms of the problems, which is great, and it totally lines up with my mindset. You talked a lot about what you called, it was either your 5 pillars of health or the 5 performance killers, and how that ties into health and performance issues for athletes, especially as we age. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I think people will find that really interesting.
Yeah, so I'll credit some of the idea of putting this framework together from a similar group of healthcare practitioners in the States who, from Nourish, Balance, Thrive, and a like-minded doctor over in the US who's actually trained in the UK, Dr. Tommy Wood. And really, when they looked at thousands of athletes who they'd helped out with the typical sort of symptoms of not being able to access their top end of intensity when they're training, not feeling like sleep is restoring them, waking up still feeling tired, struggling sometimes with gas and bloating, with digestion problems, putting on weight, all those sort of things that will resonate with a lot of listeners, and possibly some of those with yourself. and then really looking at what had been uncovered as sort of the top 5 common themes that really are affecting endurance athletes. And a lot of this will be synonymous with the general population as well. And really the common things are problems with hormones, and sex hormones in particular. Testosterone is the one that people will think of first. Issues with imbalance in our gut microbiota. And by that we mean the healthy bacteria and yeast, etc., that are resident in all of our large bowels. And they perform a lot of very important functions. And they're really sort of symbiotic with us as humans. But when those bacteria become imbalanced, then it can start causing problems and causing some of these symptoms.
Okay.
The other issue is how will we be able to control our blood sugar? At the extreme end is when somebody actually starts becoming diagnosed as type 2 diabetic. But long before that, there can be issues at how well we're controlling that. The next one is really how well we're regulating our circadian rhythm, our natural flux of hormones over the 24-hour day, and how the whole system from our brain down to our various hormone glands is functioning as part of that whole day-night rhythm. And that's obviously controls how both our sleep quality and quantity. And then the fifth one of these themes is how well we can deliver oxygen to our cells. And that will be the one all athletes are aware of. That's our sort of VO2 max anaerobic threshold. A big player there is going to be just how well we can deliver oxygen to our muscle. And almost all of these 5 themes are closely interrelated. So problems in one will cause problems in one of the others. And any one person, athlete that we're looking at that has symptoms may have underlying root causes in 1, 2, or all of these. But some may be a bigger issue than others. So it gives a nice framework to sort of stand back and get an overview and look at what are going to be the biggest return on investment, simplest things that one can make changes in your lifestyle. And it's not just about food, I'd add. It's as important as looking at what we do about sleep, what we do about stress, how we move, how we exercise, and minimizing our exposure to all manners of toxins in the environment. So it's really everything.
It's very interesting you mentioned there, because my next thought was to go, let's talk about food, but with you spending so much time there focusing on, sleep and circadian rhythms and the effect that has on our hormones, I'm laughing to myself because since we talked a month ago, obviously a big part of the change that's happened for me is changing the way that I've been eating. And in a way, because that's quite visible, that's quite an easy change to make, because every time I go to the fridge, there's different stuff in there. The big challenge for me has been my habits of basically needing more sleep, needing to get to bed earlier, needing higher quality sleep. It's been a really difficult habit for me to break, and I'm nowhere near it still. I'll put my hands up. Last night I thought, right, it's coming up to 10 o'clock. I need to go to bed now. I went to bed and then I carried on doing exactly what I would have done at the computer, except I was in bed for 2 more hours. And so I've become aware of this idea of, right, well, some things, there's a habit here that needs changing, that the rhythm of it is wrong. And it's definitely harder for me to accept that I need more sleep and the habit needs to change, and that will bring on a positive effect on me, because I think society conditions us all to go, successful people live on less sleep, so man up kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. And that the sleep's a great place to start, actually, rather than the nutrition, probably.
Yeah.
And that's a great example there. And I'm exactly the same. So we're all different in terms of how well we can make behavioral changes and habit changes. And I find it really easy to make nutritional changes. I can very easily discipline myself to train, etc. But because I'm trying to spin so many plates like most of us are, a young family and all the rest of it, the sleep discipline is the hardest. And it's the one that's still a work in progress. And there's lots of different ways to try and approach these sort of habit changes. But if we get the sleep wrong, everything else fails. So let's look at it as an example. If you sleep too little or your quality of sleep, so you could sleep enough hours, but you don't have enough REM sleep and deep sleep within that sleep, that can disrupt your gut microbiota and actually directly change and imbalance the bugs in your gut.
Right.
It can cause blood sugar dysregulation if you sleep 5 hours less than 7 hours instead of 7 hours for a single night. It makes your blood sugar control for the next 24 hours 25% worse.
Wow.
It will, if you don't sleep enough, it ultimately causes inflammation. And it's one of the many factors that may lower your testosterone production. So we can see that if we mess up sleep, it's affected blood sugar dysregulation, gut dysbiosis, and low sex hormones. So it's affected 3 out of the other 5 pillars.
Yeah, that's
just
really
through the one pillar,
isn't it? Yeah.
It'll cause an increase in the stress hormone cortisol. That's going to affect how you control blood sugar, but it'll also affect how you increase lean muscle mass if it's excessive. And then, of course, if you're training really hard, you only gain the adaptation to the training during the deep sleep phases of sleep. So if you've done a big training block that day, if you end up sleeping 5 hours instead of 7 hours that night, you kind of wasted your time. You've negated half of the benefit from the big training effort. And you've not really got maximum return on investment from the endurance effort and the strength training.
Wow. It's so obvious, isn't it, when you get told the facts in front of you? That you think, well, when someone says you literally, there is no, I remember years ago a physio saying to me, if you're going to do your strength training first thing in the morning and then do your aerobic workout, you may as well have not done the strength training. And I thought, wow. And it's the same here, isn't it? If you do all this other stuff and you cram it all in, but then you don't sleep and everything else becomes wrecked because of it, you really have to start questioning what you're doing and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, a lot of these things cost nothing.
Yeah.
But it costs a lot of effort and discipline. But I think and that's one of the biggest issues we have with all of this stuff. The general medical approach of trying to find a pharmacological treatment, a new drug, and treat a symptom of a particular chronic problem, that's actually very attractive for people because it's very easy to pop a pill.
Yeah.
But to make behavioral changes, particularly around sleep, is much, much more challenging. And we know that just giving people information for the vast majority isn't enough, doesn't work, even though, like you said yourself, it's the right thing to do. But last night you still fell into that trap of doing the extra couple of hours of screen work in bed. So it's actually coming up with techniques as well for creating these behavioral changes in a manageable way. Saying to yourself, well, I'm just going to try and change one small thing and do that for a week and then build in the next small element and make small little wins that are psychologically boosting and then keep adding on these small wins till you eventually arrive at completely getting the complete behavioral change. Is one very good way about going about doing these things. If you say sleep, for instance, maybe the first thing you say about improving circadian regulation of hormones is to make sure as soon as you get up in the morning to try and get outside and get exposure to natural light as quickly as possible. Because we know the more natural light we get before noon in the day starts to normalize our regulation and release of the key hormones around the control of that sleep-wake cycle, and that's our cortisol, our melatonin, and adenosine. So that could be just the first thing one does, and then you keep building on top of that habits.
For me, it even feels like just tracking this kind of stuff would be a really great place to start. I've got Training Peaks there that records the training that I do and plans out the training I'm going to do. I pay no attention whatsoever to when I'm going to go to bed, when I get up. It's all completely random. I never track it. I couldn't tell you outside of, last night what my sleep habits are. But if it's so fundamental, it's something I need to take care of, it sounds like.
Absolutely, and tracking can be a great way to do it. That's what I've done, because I perceive sleep as equally the thing I need to work the hardest at, and the hardest for me to get wrong, and basically stay up too late working on my laptop. So I moved to a wearable called the Oura Ring, and there's more than one product out there. But that sleep tracking is something that allows me to, if I can see in front of me on the app bad sleep scores, the idea is that it shames me into better behavior the following night. And the other thing is that there's so many different interventions one can use to try and improve sleep quality and quantity. And a lot of them will work for everybody, but some are quite individualized.
Okay.
So if you're tracking things, you can try certain interventions and then measure it and see, did that change sleep quality? If it does, carry on using it. Obviously, if it made no difference, well, bin it. Don't waste time, and then try a different intervention. And that could be anything from what time you finish eating food in the day to the sort of food you've eaten to meditation last thing. The list goes on.
Yeah.
But the tracking is useful. But on the other side of the coin, some people could get a bad reaction to tracking. So you need to understand yourself. Because what you don't want, some people may just see bad sleep scores and become stressed by it.
Right.
Rather than use it as a useful, practical lever to make change. It could be something that they don't make any change, but see it each day and get more stressed because they get a bad sleep score.
Yeah.
And then they've got a different problem. Then they've got an increase in stress, which then drives all sorts of other problems. So I suppose it's kind of understanding yourself a bit and understanding what levers work for you.
Yeah.
And how to manipulate them.
It's interesting you mentioned the Oura Ring. I remember I interviewed Paul Newsom from Swim Smooth a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that after we'd had the interview as well, that him and his business partner were wearing these and almost they'd recognized that they needed more sleep, and they kind of gamified it by saying, right, we're going to see who can get the most REM sleep tonight, tracking it using this. And I thought, so if that's the kind of thing, and that definitely works for me, the gamification of it and the completion of ticking little boxes off at the end of a week. So maybe it's something that I need to look into as well. Yeah, I think there might be a few nodding heads listening to this.
It's also useful, obviously, to could be a third party that reviews it. I've had a few athletes I've suggested it to, and clients of mine, they've got them, and of course, I can access their Oura details, and then if there's somebody else looking at it, then it's accountability.
Yeah.
And then somebody external who's then making the suggestion. So if it is an individual who's going to get stressed out by seeing a bad sleep score, another option is engaging with someone like myself or you as a triathlon coach to look at it just the way you'd look at their training peaks.
It would be a really good addition, wouldn't it, to know that about your athletes? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're not just getting the sleep data, you're getting the heart rate variability data and all the other metrics around recovery and activity, because you can enter all of your training in there as well.
Right. Okay.
I'm certainly not trying to sell or endorse the Oura Ring, but it's just in terms of wearables and trackers can be useful.
Yeah.
And obviously useful for more than one function apart from sleep.
Yeah.
But it is, as with everything, it can just be an expensive item if you don't actually utilize the data.
Yeah.
Changes and interpret it properly.
That makes total sense. Right, well, let's talk about diet next then. That seems to be the next place to go, doesn't it? And changes that people can make in the diet. Because in the process of the conversation that you and I had, one great thing you had me do was to track all of the food that I ate over 3 days. And again, it's one of the things I've had my athletes do at times when they're trying to make interventions, but it's not something I'd ever done myself. And so it came as a massive surprise to me when I actually tracked what I actually ate rather than what I was thinking I was eating. And I mean, even before I talked to you, the results were pretty astonishing to me. And it was obvious that I was eating far too much of some stuff and nowhere near enough of something else. And things were just completely out of balance.
Yeah, it's quite an eye-opener, isn't it? Once we actually, I suppose, just like the sleep tracking, until you actually see it in front of you. Analogous to that is, getting videoed in the swimming pool.
Yeah.
We've all got no idea what our stroke's doing, and we think it's doing one thing and it's doing something completely different.
I like that analogy. That's exactly what it's like. Yeah. Looking at my own food over 3 days was equivalent of seeing my own swimming stroke for the first time, for sure, because I thought, I didn't realize my diet looked like that.
Well, I think the first thing that I would say about nutrition and diet in general is that there's no one perfect diet for all humans.
Yeah.
We're all bio-individual in terms of the way our biochemistry works, but there are certain general things we can all agree on from a scientific basis. And what we would all agree on is that we should focus on a whole foods diet. So if something didn't move or grow, don't eat it. So generally anything processed is inherently not going to be good for us. So highly refined carbohydrates and items that are processed and packaged. So if you've got to read the label and it's got 20 or 30 ingredient list, it's not going to do you any favors. It's going to have items in it that have a lot of industrial seed oils, high in sugars, and all of those things are inflammatory to everybody, including athletes.
Yeah.
The other broad things in terms of nutrition is that what's good for you this year may not be exactly the perfect nutrition for you in a year's time. So it is going to change over time. The health of our gut microbiome is going to change the way we're able to manage different foods. So that has an influence, and that's part of what I mean by being bio-individual. And then the other sorts of details around eating and food is the timing of when we eat, and the time where we time different sorts of macronutrients makes a difference. And then it's also thinking about not just about the caloric density of foods, in other words, how many calories we're getting in, but the key is also making sure that what we eat is as nutrient dense as possible.
Yeah.
And if we think of what most of the Western world have been eating for the last 30 years, it's incredibly caloric dense. In other words, there's loads and loads of calories, but very, very poor in nutrient content in terms of the standard Western diet that's highly processed, lots of refined carbohydrates. So it's missing out on lots of vitamins and minerals, essential amino acids and proteins, etc. So I suppose that's just sort of the broad view of things. Yeah. Of course, one of the big issues is that we have contradicting messages every single week or day in the major media, websites, podcasts, documentaries. They're very topical at the moment, certainly in the last 3 weeks, doing the rounds. And most of these are filled with misinformation or cherry-picked research studies. And part of the big problem is when it comes to nutritional research, it's not even really research. It's very, very weak research. So we really, to a large extent, have to look at high-quality randomized control studies, and we have to look at how have humans thrived as a species for over 2 million years. And really, most of the problems we're dealing with have surfaced in the last 30 to 40 years with the changes we've made in how we eat. But we thrived prior to that.
Yeah. Hey, well, listen, let's. I'm happy for people to sort of hear. Really, to be food shamed. I'm happy to be food shamed on the podcast. We'll go through what we saw when we just looked at 3 days of my diet. And for a bit of context for the people listening, I've been vegetarian for the past 4 years. It was vegetarian, including fish and dairy, for the first 3 of those years. And then over the last year, it had pretty much gone down to almost completely I wouldn't say vegan diet, but almost completely animal product free. I was still having a bit of cheese because I enjoyed having a pizza once a week, but that was pretty much the only animal products I was taking in, and went through a phase of feeling fantastic for about the first 2 or 3 months when I first went onto the completely animal product free diet, and then basically felt worse and worse and worse over time. And then when we tracked what I was eating with you, what we saw was there was firstly a huge amount of carbohydrates was in there. I was defaulting to a huge bowl of pasta and oil effectively. And I think that's leading back into being a kid who was a runner in the 80s and read about the importance of a high carb diet and perhaps defaulted back to almost what I knew as a kid. But when you had me upload all of the foods through, remind me of the name of the app that we used.
And this is probably a very useful app for listeners, Chronometer.
That's right.
So there are many of these food apps around, but this one is excellent in that it doesn't just break down the macronutrients, but it breaks down the micronutrients of the food. So it gives a very nice overview of all the minerals and vitamin content of the eating for the day.
Yeah. And that was a really surprising thing for me, in that I'd been using MyFitnessPal and trying to keep a track of, fat, protein, carbohydrate, and was aware I was a bit low on protein and I was a bit high on carbs, but kind of shrugged my shoulders. Using this chronometer, it was incredibly obvious. It laid out all the levels of all the various vitamins and subvitamins in front of me. And there were huge sections where I was just getting none, like literally getting none, despite eating tons of salad every day. There were just entire sections that were missing for days on end.
Yeah, and I suppose we could summarize that almost by saying, when I reviewed your diet there, at that point it was a calorie dense but nutrient poor.
Yes.
Eating. And this again isn't to demonize any particular macronutrient. Low carbohydrate, to me, when it comes to athletes, it's a relative term.
Yeah.
It's relative to amount of training and calories we're burning, where we are in our training cycle, the time of the day, etc. But when we looked at your data, I vaguely off the top of my head, I think you were consuming around 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrate a day.
Yeah.
But you'll say yourself that you weren't doing intense training over this period of time. It was really sort of moderate distance runs, 30 to 40 minute runs, bit of swimming. So you really wouldn't be requiring that sort of carbohydrate requirement. As opposed to somebody at the peak end of an Ironman prep, where they may be utilizing 200-300 grams of carbs. So it's all relative, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. The next thing that struck me was when we looked at my protein intake. Now, the protein was something that, again, I knew I should have been taking care of. I knew I should have been having more of it when I was, eating an entirely vegetarian diet. It wasn't something I was ever really tracking. And again, I look back and I think I was stupid and I kicked myself for it. But I think it's a very similar story to a lot of my friends who've followed a similar path from having talked to them. I was getting nowhere near enough protein in, and the protein that I was getting from plant proteins, it sounds like it wasn't really doing the job I needed it to.
Yeah, and that's also, just while we're on it, an important point to make, even about tracking the food intake with Chronometer. When it tells you your micronutrients and macros that you're consuming, that's still not guaranteeing that you're able to absorb all of that efficiently.
Yeah.
So that's sort of part of the equation. So you could see a good protein intake off a certain amount of food, but it's not guaranteed that you're effectively absorbing all of that, because not all protein sources are absorbed equally well in the gut, and the same for various vitamin sources, etc. Protein in general, I think, can be one of the biggest problems or challenges for people to take in. I think often traditionally we think of mostly strength athletes needing to get in larger amounts of protein. But there's plenty of sports science showing that endurance athletes doing significant endurance training volumes need pretty much similar protein dosaging per kilogram to what strength athletes need. And we can break down a lot of muscle mass during long endurance workouts. So it's pretty key to make sure we keep up the protein intake. So I think sort of a ballpark for people that are training hard is really sort of 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram of protein a day. So if you're talking somebody that's 70 kilograms, we're really talking anything from 100 to 140 grams per day. And if you start tracking that, you see pretty commonly, I mean, I've got your app open here, and just one of the days I looked at was 96 grams, 80 grams, and it's quite hard actually to get that amount of protein in.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, and particularly this is seen even more commonly in female athletes. Find it harder generally than males to keep up the protein intake. The other thing is that there's a limit to how much protein you can absorb in a single sitting or a single meal. So when you do work out your daily requirement, you need to ideally spread that out over sort of 3 to 4 intakes, if you will, because you don't really absorb more than, say, 30 to 40 grams at one time. And then again, timing, you'd ideally want to get in a dose of protein soon after you finish a really hard workout, and that to make sure that we're minimizing any catabolism and muscle breakdown. So it's all about where you spread out the dose, the actual total dose, and timing again.
And it's interesting as well. You've got those
and then protein quality. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, we'll come back to that in a second, because I want to talk again about the difference between. You talked to me about the bioavailability of animal protein against plant protein, but the phase you've got there, those 3 days that we tracked, I'd restarted eating fish at this point, and I can remember really clearly having had 2 salmon fillets on each of those days, which are probably 20 to 25 grams each. So without those salmon fillets, I would have been another 50 grams of protein less even. So I feel as I must have been living in a massive protein deficit for the last year at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. And when one makes dietary changes, you can feel the effects quite quickly in terms of macronutrient changes, like suddenly changing your carbohydrate. You know, anybody will feel immediately the difference as they go from high carbohydrate to low carbohydrate.
Yeah.
But things like changes in protein won't show themselves up for potentially many months until you're gradually losing muscle mass and power and output at the top end. And it'll be even much more subtle, becoming deficient in vitamins and minerals. You could get away with that for 6 months, maybe up to 2 years, and then one starts to feel the effect. So you quite often will get this initial phase where you make a particular dietary change and feel great, and it's often because you've got rid of a lot of bad things. Somebody may move to a clean eating sort of diet, got rid of a lot of packaged foods and takeaways, etc. Feel great initially because anything's better than what they were eating before. But then after 6 months to a year to 2 years, things start going backwards again. And that sort of that build-up effect of becoming short on all those micronutrients.
And what's the difference between the absorbability, if that's in fact a word, of animal protein against plant-based proteins?
Well, the absorption of almost all vitamins and micronutrients is more easy, more efficient for our gut than plant-derived substances, because essentially the ruminant animal has eaten the plant already, and their system has broken it down, absorbed it, and activated it into a form that animal cells can actually utilize. Because various vitamins come in different forms. They often come in a pro form that can't actually be used by the cell. And then various enzymes will activate that vitamin into a format that can then actually be used in the chemical reactions in the cells of our body to do the job they need to do. So the animal's kind of done that for us already. So when we eat it, when we eat those sort of foods, we can absorb it quite readily, and it's already in the format that can be utilized. Plants need to be broken down by our gut first and then absorbed. and then activated. So there's several things there. Not everybody's gut is as effective at both digestion and absorption of all of these sorts of foods. Not everybody has the same efficiency of their enzymes in being able to activate all of these different vitamins and substances. And then when it so that's in terms of the vitamins and the minerals.
Yeah.
When it comes to things like proteins, not all different sources of protein have the same makeup of amino acids. Because, of course, a protein ultimately in your body needs to be broken down in your gut into smaller chunks that you can absorb it, and then ultimately broken down into the smallest units, which are these little amino acids. And each amino acid, the amino acids, when they actually get inside your body, are what are going to work inside the cells, either to make hormones, to build muscle, to make neurotransmitters, to supply our DNA inside our cells. So incredibly key functions. And you really need a broad spread of all those important amino acids. So we take one as an example, the amino acid that's quite key for building muscle mass and what we call muscle protein synthesis is leucine. And the amount of leucine in plant protein is incredibly low. I don't have the data open in front of me to give you an exact number, but I can always supply this for if you want to include anything in show notes. But it's sort of only a small proportion of what you would get in the equivalent amount of animal protein.
I see.
In, say, for example, pea protein. Now, this is not to say that you couldn't get the amount of protein you need on a plant-based diet, but you would have to do it very carefully. You'd have to know what you're doing and realize that you need to consume a vastly higher quantity of plant protein to get the same amount of amino acid as you would off eating a small amount of animal protein. Or you would need to supplement that by taking essential amino acids as a supplement, or various other protein powders. And also realizing that if you're consuming a much higher volume of plant protein source, you're going to then automatically have to be consuming a much higher amount of carbohydrate that comes along with it. So you could be completely overdoing one macronutrient, carbohydrate, in order to satisfy the correct amount of the other macronutrient, protein.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The devil's always in the detail.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about vitamin B12 and the importance of that in the diet, and how hard that is, or impossible how that is to get from a purely plant-based diet?
Yeah, so vitamin B12 is really quite a key vitamin, plays a large number of important roles. It's key for nerve function, in terms of how our nerves conduct electricity in their nerve health. It's also very key in energy production. It's one of the key factors in the little energy factories in every cell in the body, our mitochondria. And I'm sure the athletes mostly will have heard of this term of mitochondrial health.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're doing, obviously, with our training, is to try and increase the amount of mitochondria in our muscle cells, etc. So B12 is quite key in how the mitochondria produce energy. So that's just two of their many roles in the body. The B12 deficiency itself is actually small levels of deficiency are very common, and they become more and more common as we age. Certainly, once we get over 50, our gut is far less efficient at being able to absorb B12. And part of that's to do with increasing autoimmune issues relating to the cells involved in the B12 absorption. But one of the other issues is that B12 can only really be derived from animal products. So unless you're getting good sources of B12 intake, you really do need to supplement B12 to ensure that you're not running into B12 deficiency. And B12 deficiency can be quite insidious. And if it becomes more advanced, the big risk is the potential for permanent nerve damage, which can't be reversed. So if one is having a diet that's potentially low in B12, that would be somebody who it would be important to check B12 level, at least annually, and then act on that if it's starting to show signs of tending towards deficiency. And the other thing I'd say is, even if one is taking in animal products, there's a limit to how much you can absorb in one go, a little bit like protein we spoke about earlier. So you need to spread those B12 containing foods over the course of your day to keep up on top of B12 status.
And you mentioned it was important last time that if you are taking a B12 supplement, that it was one of the droppers that goes under the tongue rather than tablet form?
Yeah, B12 that you swallow and goes through the gut has got a very poor bioavailability. So bioavailability just means how much of what you take in actually ends up in your circulation, in your cells. And certain foods, certain drugs, certain things we take in, for one reason or another, either don't get absorbed very well, or they get absorbed, but they get broken down in the liver before they can actually get to where they need to be. So you don't actually end up with very much at all. So if you are taking a supplement, it's better to get a good quality sublingual. Well, it either should be a sublingual, in other words, a spray under the tongue. When it gets absorbed under the tongue, it's essentially going straight into your blood circulation, and it's bypassing your gut. And if somebody has more severe deficiency that they're seen by their GP or their own doctor, they might need to actually get B12 injections. And again, that's bypassing the gut. It's just a direct absorption into your circulation. But oral tablets are generally going to be a waste of time. There will be a very poor absorption.
Interesting. Okay. And then what about vitamin D? That was the other big deficiency that we saw in my blood test, was the vitamin D levels are really low. And obviously we know that's associated with sunlight. So no surprise there that we don't have a huge amount of that living in the UK winter. Tell us a little bit about the vitamin D and the importance of that, please.
Well, firstly, again, various sources of vitamin D are animal products, eggs, dairy, are going to have our highest concentrations of vitamin D. But then again, even with good intake of vitamin D, unless we activate the vitamin D, it's not going to be able to do what we need it to do. And activation is essentially sunlight exposure. And really, even 15 minutes of sunlight exposure can give us the equivalent of sort of around 2,000 units of vitamin D. So it's very effective. And coming back round to the whole sunlight thing, it just shows us again the huge power of a simple intervention. If we can get outside and get exposed to natural light in the first part of the day in the morning, we're busy resetting circadian rhythm to improve sleep quality. We activating vitamin D. It also increases something called nitric oxide, which is another key little chemical circulating around our body that helps to keep blood pressure down, but also helps with energy production and reduce cardiovascular disease. So we do one thing and we've achieved several important outcomes. But nevertheless, in our winter over here, unfortunately, I think a lot of athletes would still need to consider supplementing vitamin D on top of doing all the right things naturally, depending, of course, measuring it and seeing what the vitamin D level is. Actual vitamin D levels to target, it's quite controversial, and there's a huge number of recommended vitamin D ranges from all sorts of different medical societies. But there is some sports science evidence to indicate higher levels being useful in athletes, and has been shown to reduce the incidence of infections over the winter in high volume endurance athletes who target a level of between 100 and 125 nanomoles per liter. Whereas you'd normally see on a standard blood test that's done indicating levels around 50 as being adequate, 50 to 60 as being adequate. Whereas we may see benefit targeting higher levels, closer to 100. In individuals performing, and certainly also in individuals with certain sorts of chronic health problems.
Okay, so would there be any dangers for people taking either B12 or vitamin D supplements in terms of, obviously there's the possibility of drowning under it, but can you take too much and is it dangerous?
So vitamin B12 has no danger in taking too much of it. In fact, it's one of the only vitamins that it's been well established that there is no toxic upper limit.
Right. Okay.
For the vitamin. By that, I'm not saying go out and try to overdose yourself in vitamin B12.
No, sure.
And if you supplement it with sublingual vitamin B12, you may actually find that when you do a blood test and they look at your serum B12 levels, they may come back as really high. Sometimes 1,000, and that may worry your own doctor if they see that. But that doesn't actually that has no evidence whatsoever that relates to any risk at all, and that's actually just measuring the amount of B12 in your blood, but not the amount of B12 inside the cells. Whereas the blood test that I think that you've seen through Thriver, where they do active B12, that's actually a slightly different test, and that's looking at the B12 that's actually being utilized by the cells. So that's B12. Vitamin D we can overdose, and just like most things, too much or too little is a bad thing. So if one is supplementing vitamin D, it really needs to be under the direction of somebody who knows what they're doing in terms of the correct supplement dose to take on in addition to your food. And I would periodize it. We obviously need more in the winter than what we need in the summer. It's going to change depending on what vitamin D you get in through food sources. So if one is starting a vitamin D supplement, it would be wise to recheck your levels within 2 or 3 months to check. And the other thing that's important with vitamin D is that one takes a product that combines vitamin D with vitamin K2, because vitamin K2 is another very important vitamin, and one of its many roles, it's involved with how well our blood clots, but it's also involved with how where the calcium at vitamin D is involved with controlling. It controls where that calcium ends up. So if we just take vitamin D alone and we push our vitamin D levels up, there is a risk that we end up creating calcification in our blood vessels, which would obviously be a bad thing, as opposed to where we want it, and that's inside our bones to increase bone health and the other things we're doing. So the vitamin K2, in conjunction with the vitamin D, ensures that the vitamin D effects end up in the right place.
Well, one of the really interesting things that's come from chatting with you is, initially for me, the big worry having had the blood test done was it looked like I had low testosterone levels. Immediately my brain jumped and said, well, that's the problem. That's why you feel exhausted. You've got low testosterone. You know you're an aging man. Testosterone production drops off. I've read all manner of books where professional cyclists have doped themselves with testosterone, and that's had an improving effect on them. And so the temptation was to think, well, if I had extra testosterone, all these horrible fatigue syndromes would go away. Maybe that's the answer. But it's been obvious in talking to you that it's a much more holistic overview that we need to look at everything from diet and sleep. And that's really a very simple thing to take care of, rather than going to the fix of, get yourself seen at the clinic and get testosterone prescribed.
Absolutely. And this is another great analogy to what we spoke about in the beginning, those 5 performance killers. Because every one of those could be a reason for a drop in testosterone. But I think the first place we've got to start, and obviously before I get into that, the urge people will have is to do the quick fix. Go ask somebody to prescribe a testosterone replacement therapy, which firstly, if you're a high level athlete who's going to be drug tested, it's a non-starter because it's banned under WADA, so that's out. But that would be the quick fix, isn't it? And that would be the downstream approach. That would be just trying to treat the symptom and throw in more testosterone. And of course, once you start taking it, that's you for life, because you're going to downregulate your own receptors and you'll never be able to come off it again. But the correct approach would be the much harder to do behavioral changes of the upstream approach of looking for the root causes. And the first thing is one's problem and symptoms actually testosterone or low testosterone? Because what we do know is there are people who can have what we would consider to be total testosterone levels below the so-called reference ranges, but actually be performing at an incredibly high level. So it's not just about testosterone. And there has been a study looking at Kona pro triathletes where they tested them for total testosterone after Kona, and half of them had testosterone levels that were less than 10, which would be lower than a 25-year-old male's. And these guys, this is a top end. So it's not just about that testosterone. So it is about taking a careful history and seeing whether the symptoms add up to really being symptoms of low testosterone, or are the symptoms they're experiencing other causes for fatigue. Is it are they getting their nutrition right, their calories, their sleep, and all the other bits? But if we do decide that it is related to low testosterone and it's low relative for them and what they're doing, there's a whole host of things that could cause that. And there's a huge pathway involved in how we make testosterone. We've got to release a series of hormones in our brain that then speak to and if it's a male, speak to our testes. It's a female, and testosterone is important in our females as well. Speak to the adrenal gland in females to make testosterone. At every step on that process, there are things that can either make that step work better, or things that could be blocking it. And the very common issues in athletes and triathletes is going to be inadequate sleep, overtraining, and relatively too little calories when people are in very high phases of training and high volume training. And the extreme end is what's now quite well recognized as something called RED-S, relative energy deficiency syndrome. And a lot of people might have seen the press recently with a high-level runner in the US who's come out against Roberto Salazar coaching, in terms of she's ended up at RED-S with amenorrhea and serious drops in bone mineral density and multiple stress fractures, etc.
Yeah.
And part of that whole triad is that you end up with bone mineral. It's basically drops in males, it's drops in testosterone, in females, drops in estrogen and testosterone. And constant to that, they end up with a drop in bone density. You get these 25-year-old high-level athletes with the bones of a 70-year-old. And then fatigue and all the other problems that go with that. So, the big hitters is first check that somebody's not totally under-consuming calories, not totally overtraining or too much intensity in training and need to, for a while, back off and just move to more aerobic-based training and a much lower proportion of intensity for a period of time, if it's become a real issue. And then the sleep quality. If sleep's poor, that's going to increase cortisol. And if we have high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, our pathway for making testosterone has multiple branches in it. And there's one of the sort of, if you think of it as sort of fork in the road in this pathway, can either go down the pathway that leads to testosterone, or it can take a different pathway and end up at cortisol. So we could end up stealing testosterone to make cortisol. So linking in with that, high levels of stress are going to do exactly the same thing. So really those upstream things are the first things to look at. Is somebody getting enough calories?
Yeah.
Do they have high levels of stress, and can reduce stress either by getting rid of things that are causing stress? And stress is everything. It's work stress, it's spinning too many plates, are we carrying chronic infections, are we getting exposed to lots of toxins and pollutants, too little sleep is a stress, etc. So we can remove things causing it, or we can include interventions to improve it, like mindfulness, like breathing techniques, and so on. So we got all of that, and then we can then it's possibly looking at bloods. We can look at we've looked just at total testosterone, but if I'm looking at this holistically, I might look at other measurements, things called luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone, forgetting about the big words, but essentially they the substances released from the brain to stimulate the testes to make testosterone. So we really need to know, is the problem higher up? Is the problem in the brain? Or is the problem lower down? Is it where we're making the testosterone? Or is it the cells that are getting testosterone, but the receptors there aren't enough of them not working properly to do it? So you can see it's a complex system, and it needs teasing out. And it'll often be more than one of these factors that need addressing.
And it all comes back to, like you said earlier on, it's the basics of calories, training intensity, sleep quality, and reducing stress. All of the things you need to fix in order to fix the end result that you see, which is low testosterone, rather than thinking.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I've ended up with this. I've had levels of things tested and thought, I need to fix the levels of things. When in reality, it's all those things in me that are out of whack. It's the high levels of stress, the too many plates spinning, the not getting enough sleep, the trying to layer training on top of that when everything else is going on. And ultimately, that's, the blood tests and the levels of vitamins and things have shown up the end result of the problem, but not what the problem itself was. So that's been a big learning.
That's right. And the basics are going to take care of 80% of people's 80% of their issues. And then some of them might need to see somebody like myself to take a much more detailed look under the hood or under the bonnet, to look for the more subtle things to correct that last sort of 10% of performance. But really, unless we do these basics right, none of the fancier stuff is going to work anyway.
Well, let's finish by telling people about your private practice and where they can find out more about you if they're interested in having a consultation with you and finding out what's going on with them. Because you run, it's bestu-functionalhealthclinic.co.uk is your website, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Rob. Thanks for that. I essentially, everything we've talked about today, I'm happy to see anybody either with chronic health problems, or athletes who perceive their performance as dropping off. They might be putting it down to middle-age wear and tear, but possibly these are things, as we've discussed today, that can be improved and rooted out. And then it might be an athlete who feels completely healthy, but they really are high level and looking for anything they can do to eke out that last 1 or 2%, and looking at some of the detail and some of what sports science has uncovered as some of additional tweaks that one can do. And then really looking at what we can do to maintain high level performance, but stay metabolically and internally as healthy as possible. And I think it's quite possible to achieve both at the same time, to maintain health and performance and try and do it together.
Well, that's a great place to leave it, I think, man, to maintain health and performance and keep them both together. I think that's what we're all striving for at the end of the day. Anton, thank you so much for your time coming on. It's been fascinating to hear all the medical details, but also how you put together the whole thing holistically. It's answered tons of questions for me, and I think lots of people listening will have learned loads from it as well.
Brilliant. Thanks for inviting me on, Rob.
Thank you very much for your time. All right, guys, I hope you found that interesting. I listened back to it and I was amazed by the amount of stuff that I'd missed the first time through, and I'd even taken some notes on it the first time I went through. So I think the big takeaways for me are those 5 pillars, the 5 performance killers. So make sure we're taking care of our hormone levels, our gut microbiome, blood sugar control by eating the right things and cutting down on the amount of simple sugars, get our circadian rhythms sorted out by making sure we get the right amount of sleep, and the delivery of oxygen will take care of itself. So tons and tons of information there for you. And remember, you can get yourself a Thriver blood test with 50% off using the code OxygenAddict50. All right, a little bit of news before we wrap up today's show. Just one thing from me this week. The voting is open for 220's awards, the 220 magazine. And if you are going to vote, I'd really appreciate it if you saw your way clear to voting for me in the Coach of the Year award that they have. We got really close last year. I got second place, and I'm desperate to win the Coach of the Year. I grew up reading 220 magazine, and I'd absolutely love to get that award and kind of have it as part of the Oxygen Addict community and show that sometimes the little guys can wheedle through and help a lot of people out and do it through non-traditional means. So yeah, if you are going to vote, I'd really appreciate a vote for me if you think that the advice you've had from the show over the years has helped you out. All right, guys, just before we wrap this up then, another shout out to our other sponsor, precisionhydration.com. You need to be taking care of your electrolytes if you're training indoors on the treadmill or indoors on the watt bike or the turbo trainer. Keep your electrolyte levels topped up using their specialized electrolytes with different amounts of sodium in each packet. So if you've not tried it before, use the code OxygenAddict to get £9.99 worth of free product. And if you have used it before, make sure you keep using it all the way through the winter for your indoor training, because you are going to sweat more and you've got to keep those electrolyte levels correct if you want to sort of avoid cramp and keep your training as optimum as it can be. All right, then. So thanks again to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, Thriver.co. Use the code OxygenAddict50 for 50% off your first test. And if you're looking for triathlon coaching for this year with the new season just beginning, get in touch with us over at teamoxygenaddict.com. We've got a simple contact us form on the website that you can hit us up on there, or we've got the sort of the live questioning chat box that'll come up that you can answer any questions you've got. We've got 3 different packages available. So we've got something to suit every need and every budget, hopefully. If you don't see something that you want there, just drop us a line and we'll do our best to help you out as best as we can. So remember, there's links in the show notes for all of the sponsors, so you don't have to remember them. And yeah, guys, I hope that 2020 is an absolutely cracking year for you all. Until next week, have a great, safe training and racing week. I'm Coach Rob Wilby, and you've been listening to the Oxygen Addict Triathlon Podcast. Until next week, see ya.